Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're so thankful that you joined us. We're going to have a great conversation today, kind of reimagining a 21st century safety net. We're going to talk about child savings accounts. We're going to talk about guaranteed income. We're going to talk about mixing them. We're going to talk about possibilities of taking this great work forward in the future. I'm going to figure out how to do a poll because anyone who wants to get this for CEUs, you have to let us know. So if you want a poll, if you want CEUs, put yes. And if you don't need them, put no. And we will record this. And anyone who wants CEUs, at least that want to get all 1.5 credit hours, has to stay for the whole time and has to respond to these periodic polls and questions that we give. So as you guys are answering that, I will now introduce our wonderful speakers who will be coming along. It looks like everyone's responded, so I'll end this poll. Thank you. And anybody who comes, you may want to put this in the chat later, Laura, but if anyone comes in after we've started, after this poll is ended, just ask if anyone wants to have this for CUs because we have to record that. Okay, so with that, I get to introduce our wonderful speakers. We have Jin Wong, who is he's a Center for Social Development and Washington University St. Louis kind of affiliate, but he's also at St. Louis University, and we're so thankful to have him. He's going to be talking about child savings accounts. Then we have Amy Castro, who is associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania and co-founder and faculty director of the Center for Guaranteed Income and Research, is going to talk about all the wonderful guaranteed income research she's been working on. And then hopefully at the end, we will have Willie Elliott, who is at the University of Michigan and is the founding director of the Center on Assets, Education, and Inclusion. And we'll talk about combining income and assets in innovative ways, particularly looking at what's happening in St. Paul, Minnesota. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jen. You can share your screen and show your own slides if you don't mind. And then we will keep on going. Thank you very much. You are muted and I can't see a screen yet.
Thank you, Trina. I just sent my share screen request. If you can approve that I can share my screen.
Okay, let me see where to do that. Sorry about that, everybody.
That's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. When we are waiting for the share screen, I can get started first. It's great to see you all online, and thank you very much for the grand challenge reducing extreme economic inequality for the invitation to join this webinar. So I will talk about child development accounts and child savings account. We use different terms to emphasize the different aspects of this policy idea. And then I will kind of focus on child development accounts, thinking about universal asset building as a new social welfare paradigm in the 21st century for our safety net for the economic security. And I'm going to present this idea on behalf of our research team at Center for Social Development, Washington University in St. Louis. And our team has done extensive child development account policy research, a longitudinal policy experiment in Oklahoma. So let's see if we can. Okay.
I'll have to do your slides, it looks like, because I can't figure out how to give you.
Thank you so much.
Give me just a second too.
I can also share my screen, it looks like.
Okay, good. Awesome. Well, let me stop sharing, so then go right ahead.
Give me 1 second to figure out whether I'm sharing my screen or I don't know whether, Trina, I think you are sharing the screen now at this point, right?
I stopped.
You stopped? Okay. Can you guys see my screen at this point?
No.
Okay. Trying to figure out how to do that. Okay.
We can see your screen now.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Okay, so here's the title of my talk this afternoon. Universal Asset Building as a New Social Welfare Paradigm, Research and Policy for Child Development Account. So I would like to kind of emphasize several key points in this talk. So first of all, in the 21st century, as we can see that we already see a lot of technology revolutions, including the AI revolution now, and all of these big changes, revolutions really challenge our traditional social welfare paradigms. Typically, it's based on means-tested income support. And we think universal asset building social policy are going to be a crucial component in the 21st century as a new social welfare paradigm in the AI. I think we will also talk about UBI or guaranteed income this afternoon. So we think both income support and asset building are going to be very important new paradigm in this AI time. And in addition to safety net, we also think universal asset building policies are going to focus on human development, social stability, and economic growth. Okay, so you might notice that a lot of technology leaders, they pay attention to the social policy at this point. Here, we mentioned several examples. You can see that from Bill Gates, from the godfather of AI, and even from Elon Musk and Sam Altman. So we noticed the two important kind of observations among many of these examples. So they talk about universal basic income or guaranteed income or even universal high income, right? And then one observation here we see is that universal is a key term. So in the 21st century, we see that universal based on residency or even global citizenship could be one important foundation, important idea for us to think about the future safety net policy or social policy. So universal eligibility is a very important principles for us to think about the new social welfare paradigm for the UBI or even for universal asset building. So that's one idea, one observation. Now, the other observation I would like to mention here is that if we look at the latest idea from Sam Altman, the OpenAI or Open Research has funded the largest scale of universal basic income policy research in the United States. And in summer, I think they published the first round of research results from this policy experiment. And at the same time, Sam Altman proposed a new idea called universal basic data. So in other words, when we think about income support in this 21st century, we also think about how we can guarantee this kind of income support, how we can provide the production, the means of productivity or capital to make sure all individuals universally are going to have sufficient income support. And in the AI time, to a great extent, we can think about these universal basic data as one specific form of assets. So
Jen,
from this,
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing your slides progress. I wonder if that's on a different screen.
okay, sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay. I guess maybe I can.
That works.
Okay. Yeah, I have multiple screens here, so it's kind of confusing, like which one it's the screen you can see from my end.
Right now, we're seeing a screen that says some examples and starts with
Yes,
Bill Gates.
yes. Okay, okay. Yeah, those are the several examples I mentioned here. So from these technology leaders, we can observe two important kind of trend for future social welfare policy paradigm and safety nets. I think one is the universal, it's very important, eligibility. The other one, I think, is that we emphasize both income support and asset building. So universal asset building represents one fundamental approach to achieving a more equitable distribution of primary assets or capital in the future. So I think these two trends are going to be covered in this webinar this afternoon. And I'm going to focus on universal asset building. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that universal asset building, it's not a completely new idea, and it's we can very proud to talk about this because this universal asset building idea, to a great extent, as a policy concept, was proposed by our social workers in last 3 decades. So we have done a lot of policy development, research, and policy implementations to promote universal asset building. So here we are going to focus on one unique policy idea called child development accounts. And we consider child development accounts as the cornerstone of universal asset building. So basically, child development accounts are wealth asset building investment accounts initiated by public policy. And as you can see from these slides, we emphasize multiple policy features of this policy idea. So we would like to have lifelong CDAs. So started beginning at birth as the first step for this lifelong asset building across the life course. And we already talked about that it's going to be universal for all children and all individuals, and it's going to be progressive. When we say progressive, it means it's going to provide additional and extra and greater subsidies for the disadvantaged populations, for the low-income populations, and for vulnerable populations. We also emphasize it's very important to have an automatic opening mechanism for CDAs, for child development accounts, because when we have automatic opening mechanism, it will make sure all individuals are included in this policy vehicle. And also we want to have meaningful initial deposits by governments, and plus funding mechanisms, funding sources from other mechanisms, funding sources from other mechanisms. For example, employers can provide additional assets for their employees, and we can also have nonprofit sectors to provide additional funding to accumulate assets for all children. And
Then, real quick, I'm
Mhm.
sorry to do this to you. Can you make sure that your slides are in presentation mode because you're still not going forward?
Okay, so can you see that now?
But they're not progressing. It still says Bill Gates.
Oh, okay.
Now it's progressing.
Okay. So I'm talking about the concept of CDAs, the policy idea of CDAs. Can you guys see my screen on the definition of CDAs?
Child development accounts is the cornerstone of UAB.
Yes. Okay. 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 So here it's a kind of the underlying theoretical model when we think about how both income support and assets can work together to support family and to support child development. So both financial investment and psychological effects are very important to achieve child development here. So I think this is a great theoretical model for us to think about both income support and asset building this afternoon. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about the testing of these child development ideas using the Seed for Oklahoma Kids policy experiment. So this is the largest longitudinal policy experiment of child development accounts in the United States. And the experimental design and the policy design of this study was built on the long-term research of child development accounts in the United States and in a global context. So for example, Trina has led the first quasi-experimental design research of CDAs and OCSAs in Michigan since maybe 15 or 16 years ago. And I also like Willie has done quite a lot of research on the community-based programs and city level programs, citywide programs, and state level programs of the child development accounts in the United States. So to a great extent, the Seed OK research further confirmed the previous research findings among these community-based programs, and also provide a larger scale empirical evidence built on rigorous policy experiment. And another important feature from Seed OK, which is different from previous research of CDAs, is that we really kind of follow several important policy design features for idea type CDAs. And we want to make sure such policy design can be implemented in the real world to provide a policy delivery and policy implementation mechanism to make sure we have scalable and sustainable CDA policy over the long term. So the Seed OK policy experiment was implemented in Oklahoma State, and the study was implemented in 2007 when we first randomly choose a sample from Oklahoma newborns in 2007. And we collect 3-week service data from their mothers in 2007, in 2011, and 2020. And we also have some qualitative data collecting from these mothers in 2010. So in addition to the survey data and qualitative data, we also have administrative account data continuously from the birth of these children until now. So that's about 17 years of data. Okay.
And why don't you go forward, because we still can't see yours, Jen. Just keep on moving forward.
Okay.
Now we're seeing your window screen.
Okay. Can you see my slides now?
Not yet.
I already moved my slides. I just don't know. Hold on a second.
If you want, I can quickly share if that's a little easier.
Okay. Thank you so much, Trina. So I'm going to stop sharing, and that way you can help me sharing the slides.
Okay. So tell me where you want me to go.
Can you go to slide number 7?
Okay.
Okay, so for this policy experiment, we have, Trina, could you please let me know how many minutes do I still have?
Take about 10.
Okay, take about 10, thank you. So for this policy experiment, we actually have 2 important research questions. The first one, so typically it's similar to many policy experiment we have. We want to assess financial and non-financial impacts of CDAs or CSAs for children and families. So in other words, what kind of asset effects we can identify on children and family. But in addition to that, not just focusing on the policy provision of assets, we also want to test a scalable and a sustainable policy model or policy delivery mechanism to support asset building for all children. So I think it's very important to figure out which kind of policy vehicle can be implemented in real world to support asset building for all children. Trina, could you please go to the next slide? Okay, so here is our research design for the seed OK policy experiment. As I mentioned, we have a random sample from the full population, the Oklahoma newborns in 2007, and then we oversample the racial minorities. So here I would like to emphasize that we have a random sample from a full probability sample, and not just like many interventions we have in our research, that we have participants voluntarily participating in these policy study. So with these random sample from the full probability sample, we believe we have quite strong external validity. At least we can generalize our findings back to the Oklahoma whole population. And for this random sample, half of them were assigned into the treatment group, and another half were assigned into the control group. And for the specific policy intervention of child development accounts here, we repurpose the original 529 college savings plan. So original 529 college savings plan, to a great extent, it's a regressive asset building policy, which used the tax benefits to encourage families to accumulate assets for children's post-secondary education. So as you can imagine, when we rely on tax benefit mechanism, the disadvantaged population and low-income population are most likely to be excluded from this policy vehicle. So in our policy experiment of CDAs here, we repurpose this regressive policy vehicle and trying to create a fully inclusive asset building, universal asset building policy for all children. Trina, could you please go to next slide? And here you can see that's our policy intervention. We automatically open stay-home child development accounts for all children in the treatment group, and then automatically deposit the first 1,000 initial deposit for all children. In addition to that, all of these in the treatment group, the low to median income families, they can receive additional match savings in the first 4 years based on their own deposits into the CDA accounts. So here you can see that we have progressive subsidies for the low to median income families. As I mentioned, that the policy experiment is based on the original 529 college savings plan, then all of these families, including the treatment families and the control families, they can also open their own 529 accounts, OK 529 accounts, to accumulate assets for children's post-secondary education. And we provide an extra $100 account opening incentives for the treatment families. So as you can see here, the overall CDA policy experiment in Seed OK study, it's a low touch policy experiment, policy intervention. We opened accounts, provide initial deposits and match savings, and we provide basic information for families to understand what's going on about this study, and we do not have kind of intensive community-based touch to all of these families, like talking to parents, interview parents, home visiting. So basically, it's a very low touch policy intervention. Trina, could you please go to next slide? Thank you. And this slide shows all the data we collect from the Seed OK policy experiment. As I mentioned, that we have birth record data, account administrative data, 3 weeks of survey data, and also qualitative interview data. So for 3 weeks of survey, we collect data at birth, and when children at age 4, and when children at age 14. So currently, we are kind of in the process to prepare for the wave 4 survey data collection. So we plan to collect data when children go to college, maybe the sophomore year or freshman year when they go to college. Trina, next slide, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about some financial outcomes and non-financial outcomes from these universal asset building policy experiment. So first of all, you can see that financial outcomes here at age 14, uh, that but at age 14, as you can see here, almost 100% of the treatment families, they have account open. They are holding accounts, holding assets for children's post-secondary education. Now, compared to 100% of the account holding rate among the treatment families, for the control group, we only have about account holding rate like about 4.4%. So here you can see a huge effect size. The seed OK impact is about 95%. Now, in terms of the amount of assets accumulated for children's post-secondary education here, the mean assets for the treatment families, it's about $4,400, and it's about 3.4 times higher than the control group, the control families. Trina, next slide, please. And remember, one important policy intervention component for this universal CDA policy experiment is that we provide $1,000 initial deposit at birth. And here you can see the potential of asset growing. So for this $1,000 initial deposit we provided at birth, it increased to $2,300 by age 14. So that's about 2.3 times. Trina, next slide, please. Okay, so parents can still open their own 529 accounts within this policy platform to make their own deposits to save for their children's future development. And here you can see some financial outcomes based on their participant or parent-owned 529 accounts. So by age 14, we have nearly 20% of treatment families, they open their own accounts to accumulate assets for their children. The average assets among savers, it's about $14,000. So it's about, it's 4.8 times higher than the control group. So here you can see we also have better savings outcomes among the treatment group. Now, because the saving outcomes are relying on families' own deposit, as you can see here, typically families with better socioeconomic situations, better socioeconomic status, they're more likely to select into these individual saving mechanism and to save for their children. Trina, next slide, please. Okay, so here I want to emphasize the potential of universal CDAs, universal asset building, to contribute to the economic equity, to reduce wealth inequality by socioeconomic status. So here you can see that within the population in Oklahoma, about 42% of families, they are non-white families. And in the treatment group, as the second law here, you can see that the distribution of the race, the distribution of the race among those with CDAs, it's exactly reflecting the population distribution. So in other words, there's no difference by race in terms of holding assets for their children's development after we implement this universal CDA policy in Oklahoma. So in other words, this policy intervention completely eliminate the racial disparities on account holding for children's long-term development in Oklahoma. Next slide, please. So here you can see the similar results if we do the data analysis by household income. right? So the treatment group has the income distribution completely consistent with the population in Oklahoma. Trina, next slide, please. And also by parents' education. So based on this account holding analysis, the distribution of account holding analysis, we can argue that the the automatic and universal CDAs here doing a great job to reduce economic wealth inequality, measuring by account holding. Next slide, please, Trina. So without the Oklahoma seed OK policy intervention in Oklahoma, as you can see on the left-hand side here, is that by age 14, we will only have about 500 OK 529 accounts among the low-income population, among the low-income families. But with this universal and automatic intervention, policy intervention, by age 14, now we will have about 36,000 low-income families, which who have asset building, asset accumulation for children's post-secondary already. Thank you, Trina. Next slide. So here we would like to emphasize that for universal asset building policy for child development accounts, we could have multiple sources of funding to support families' asset building. So we can have investment earnings, we can have family deposits, but we can also have funding from government, from public sector, nonprofit sector, and even the private sector. Next slide, please, Trina. In addition to the financial outcomes, we also observe positive social development outcomes or non-financial outcomes through 3 waves of data. So for example, at age 4, using the second wave of data, we see that the treatment families, the treatment mothers, they are more likely to have positive parenting behaviors. And then they typically hold a higher educational expectations for their children's future development and future education. So in early childhood, we also observe that mothers are having fewer maternal depressive symptoms. And because of these positive parent and child interactions, we also observe in wave 2, when children are age 4, we also observe that children have better social emotional development. So for several of these measures, including depression, including expectation, and social emotional development, we see the CDA impacts were greater for low-income families, for financially vulnerable families. So as I mentioned before, we have a low-touch policy intervention. However, the social development outcomes or non-financial outcomes, we observe the similar effect size like other more intensive intervention and programs like early Head Start and Head Start programs. So both the CDA policy and those programs have about 10% of effect size. Trina, next slide, please. So at wave 3, when children were about age 14, we see quite similar social development outcomes. Here you can see we have educational expectation and families' college preparation. So those families, the treatment families now are more likely to turn their higher expectation into concrete college preparation activities like psychologically and financially prepare children to go to college. And also we observe that at wave 3, parents are more likely to have positive educational engagement, like checking their children's homework, checking their grade, those kind of positive educational engagement with their children. And also similar to the positive social emotional development, we see children have lower level behavior problems in adolescent period. Trina, next slide, please. All of these social development outcomes are also supported by our qualitative findings. So you can see here that the treatment mothers talking about they feel relief, they feel security, and they have hope for the future. Next slide, please. And additional qualitative findings from our interview. Trina, next slide, please. And using the knowledge we generate from previous CDA research, like Trina's research, Willie's research, and also using research findings from the SID-OK longitudinal SID-OK policy experiment. So we have informed a multiple statewide universal CDA policy to figure out their design. So here you can see we have 7 statewide CDA policy. They all adopt the SID-OK policy design, like universal and repurpose their state level 5 to 9 college plans. Next slide, please. And here you can see the global implementation of implementation of CDAs. So here you can see 5 countries with the largest CDA numbers, account holders. So in total, we have more than 25 million CDA accounts in the global context now. Next slide, please. Here is an interesting example in Kazakhstan. This country, it's a national resources rich country, and early this year they use their revenue from gas, half of their revenue from gas, to create CDAs for all children under age 18. So the main idea is that when we face the climate change, right, climate crisis, how these resources rich country can transfer their limited resources into sustainable long-term social development. The idea here is using the CDA policy to transfer the gas resources into human capital development. Next slide, please, Trina. Okay, so I think, as I mentioned, that for the SID-OK policy experiment, we have 2 important purposes. One is trying to figure out the asset effects for child development for families. The other one is that we really want to figure out the policy design, the policy vehicle to support longitudinal, sustainable, and scalable universal asset building policy. And when we design this policy, we come up these 10 key early wealth building policy design features. And last year, the researchers in this field, they also kind of create these consents to adopt these policy design features as the basic principles for us to design the early wealth building policies for all children. So I'm not going to talk about the details of these policy principles, but the basic idea is that we adopt these policy principles in SID-OK policy experiment. And then later on, when we implement these for a lot of CDA policy development in the field, including statewide policy, including the CDA policy in other countries, many of these principles are adopted in their policy development and policy implementation. I think that's also a very important research lesson when we think about future SafeNet policy development, when we think about guaranteed income or universal basic income. So how we can make sure income support can be built, universal income support can be built on a sustainable and scalable policy vehicle, policy mechanism can be implemented in the real world to make sure all individuals, all families can receive the income support. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's kind of the final slide I have here. And that through this brief talk, I would like to provide all of you an update of the the research in the field about universal asset building and child development accounts. And I think through these long-term research, building from community-based program, citywide program, and also this long-term policy experiment, it's very important to create a policy vehicle for all kinds of safety net program. And in fact, several CDAs in other countries, like in Singapore and in Israel, they kind of combine both asset building and income support together on the same vehicle. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you, Trina.
Thank you, Jen. I'm sorry for the technology glitches that I helped do, but I'm going to do a poll now based on some of the things he shared, and let's see how you guys do. Anyone who's going for CEUs will have to respond to this, so see what you guys understood from the presentation.
While people are doing that, I believe that the chat might be disabled for the whole group. So if folks have questions for Jen, if you could put them in the Q&A section, that way he can jump to them. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll give people a few more seconds to respond to this poll, and then we will go on to Amy Castro. Going once, going twice. Okay, we're going to end this poll. If you don't get a chance to answer the poll live, you can add it to, you can't do it chat, but add it to Q&A so we can know later that you've participated. Couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Okay. I guess I can say, Jen, that the answer is supposed to be none of the above, right? Okay, here we go. I'll pass it on to you now, Amy. We will get your slides ready to go. And let me know if you can see. And I just need to get the...
Great, if you could just go to presenter mode, that'd be great.
Yep, that's what I'm trying to do. There we go.
Great. All right, thanks for having me. And just a quick shout out to sort of all my social work colleagues that are on the call. What I'm talking about today is guaranteed income, which is, if we think about what that map, that beautiful map that Jen just sort of showed to us in the last session there, sort of showed this progression of the idea of children's development accounts kind of moving across the globe. So we're on the front end of this process that sort of the CDA world has been at for a long time, and it's really exciting. So think of this as being on the beginning end. So what I'm going to talk with you all about today is guaranteed income and sort of how this fits within sort of the grand challenges by talking specifically about one of our research sites in the city of Los Angeles. Next slide. And so what I'm drawing from is sort of this body of work that we're developing at the Center for Guaranteed Income Research, which we're calling the American Guaranteed Income Studies. And so just to start out and kind of lay the groundwork in terms of terminology so that you know what it is that we're talking about. Broadly speaking, guaranteed income fits within this umbrella term of unconditional cash. So unconditional cash, you'll often hear three different terms kind of bandied about in there. The first is universal basic income, or UBI. The second is basic income. Then the third is guaranteed income. We're going to focus today on guaranteed income. But to sort of just make sure everyone knows what it is that we're talking about, when we think about universal basic income, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's universal. It's money that is no strings attached. It's recurring, and it applies to everybody who's in a given city, state, county, what have you. We have not had a true UBI in the United States. The closest thing would have been the child tax credit expansion that we had during the pandemic, but that was fairly short-lived. And then the other key feature of a UBI is that it covers all of your basic needs. A basic income is the same exact thing. It's just not universal, but again, covers all of your basic needs. And then the third category, which we're talking about today, is guaranteed income. And that shares those same features of having no strings attached, meaning you don't have to do anything to receive it. You don't have to perform behavior deemed sort of responsible by policymakers or by the public, for instance. You simply receive it because you're human, and that is the kind of the undercurrent that runs underneath this idea of unconditional cash. Now, when we think about the safety net, for what I'm hoping are mostly my social work colleagues that are on the call, unlike sort of the language that you hear coming out of the tech sector, or from a more libertarian argument, guaranteed income is not designed to work in place of the safety net. It's designed to work alongside it. So we're not looking to sort of axe all these benefits and then replace it with cash. It's designed to supplement and work alongside. So what we're doing at CGIR, we started first with the Stockton study, which most folks are familiar with. And then since then, we've kind of entered into this big wave of experimentation with unconditional cash in the United States. And so we had kind of this, how do I say, incredible opportunity, really, is what it is, to where we're able to kind of build common data, to be able to say, what would happen if we were to ask the same exact questions across all these different research sites, that we're comparing apples to apples, and we're not sort of using one set of measures in one city and then one in another, and then you can actually compare at the end of the day. So right now we're working across 38 sites in the United States. And you can download our analytic plan there, and we can also distribute it later on as well. Right now, we're working with about 20,000 people in treatment and control. And when we're done with that data set, it will be the largest database on unconditional cash in the world, to our knowledge. But I think the thing that's most exciting about it, and just to kind of own this for a minute, because I think it's important, even though we're talking about research findings here, is that this is about poverty. This is about addressing sort of inequality in the system, inequality in income, inequality in wealth. And the thing that I think I'm most excited about is when I look at just our sites, I know that by the time we're done with these 37 different experiments, we will have distributed over $100 million in unconditional cash to low-income people. And that is rather extraordinary. And I'm only just talking about my sites. I'm not talking about Dr. Hamilton's sites or anybody else's. And so we are living through a turn in the safety net. And it's being owned by social work in a way that I think we ought to all really be proud of. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that this work would not exist without the folks that have been doing incredible work in the asset building space for well over 2 decades. Next slide. So just sort of get back to this idea of common design and measurement. We use a mixed methods approach across all our research designs, primarily parallel, just because of ease of working on large teams. But you can see our core measures here. My co-PI, Dr. West, often likes to say to our cities when we're working with them is, she says, everybody gets the same cheese pizza. I mean, in the core survey, right? And then each city or location that we're working in, CBOs, things of that nature, you can add additional like toppings per se to your pizza that are specific to your populations of interest, your areas, things like that. Next slide. Thank you. And then on the qualitative side, we're working with a sort of an emerging methodology called Big Qual. And really the aim here is to pull together public discourse and policy discourse at the same time. So we know from the policy literature that each time we have a leap forward in the safety net, or we have a policy window that opens, you really need 2 things. You need consensus in the empirical literature to a point, but you also need a shift in public discourse. If you have one without the other, then you have a lopsided approach and you can't actually get anything through that window. So the way that we kind of design this is in such a way that we have politically purposive samples for most sites. And those are people who sort of consent to share their stories public with the press. Their data, in most cases, is kept separate from the main pool of data. And then we also sort of engage in sort of really rigorous qualitative research to kind of pull that then back into the main mixed methods frame. And the goal here is to really reach at theoretical generalizability, to understand what is it about this phenomenon that's shared and what is shifting based on location and context. Next slide. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about today, specifically to give an example, is Big Leap. This is a site report that we released in the end of July, beginning of August, something like that, with the city of Los Angeles. And this was sort of spearheaded underneath former Mayor Garcetti, who, as he was leaving office, worked with city council to appropriate a number of public dollars towards this particular pilot. So within Big Leap, we were working with 3,200 participants. They were receiving $1,000 per month for 12 months, no strings attached. They also had to be impacted by COVID and have a child in the home. Thanks. Next slide. So I just want to talk about context for a minute. So I mentioned this, a few minutes ago, but we are living through this extraordinary time in the United States of experimentation with cash. But we also, this isn't the first time, right? Like the roots of this movement go back to the birth of democracy. They go back to Thomas Paine, they go back to Dr. King. And so we've had these different bumps throughout US history where we've been sort of positioned to ask different questions until really maybe 2017, 2018, we had not had any experimentation really at all in the United States with cash since the Mincome experiments, which are in the late 70s, early 80s. So we're really excited to see with LA, like, what can we actually learn in 12 months? And so you hear that all these pilots that are happening, but there's still a lot of missing data. So to provide some context, this is the first large-scale RCT of unconditional cash that's positioned to show us how much change can actually happen in a year, because these big questions about how long should unconditional cash last, right? Jury's out on that for me. This is the first RCT in North America that's studying guaranteed income, IPV, and community violence since the late 70s. And then also, Big Leap, more specifically establishes sort of these questions around what does it mean to embed an intervention like this in government? Unlike sort of the open research study, which is in the news quite a bit right now, which is funded by Sam Altman through a nonprofit arm, that tells us a lot, right, about how cash may or may not work. But it's a very different thing to then actually imagine, mentalize, implement a new intervention as part of the safety net working within government. So next slide. Okay, so just some background and demographics here. I won't run through all of these, especially because the report's publicly available online and you can kind of dig through some of this yourself. But the thing I really want to highlight is the annual income there on the bottom of the chart. We're talking about one of the most expensive cities on the planet, in an incredible affordable housing crisis. And we're talking about families that are living with kids with a mean income of about $14,000 a year. So when we talk about unconditional cash and $1,000 a month, we're talking about families that are living in deep poverty. So it's a pretty substantial increase to their income. And you can see sort of, as I move through, the ways in which families really leverage this cash to make a difference in their kids' lives. Next slide. So I just realized that I neglected to include the slide on the main research questions. So you'll see some of these running across the top of the slide, and you can also download those as well if you look at our pre-analysis plan. I'm only going to highlight some of these findings. But we're really interested in looking at, how does guaranteed income affect participants' quality of life? If you're sort of familiar with the asset building world, then you sort of know that classic Ray Bashar question that came from the Federal Reserve Bank of, are you able to afford a $400 expense? This has long been a question that we've used in economic mobility research to determine how fragile the household balance sheets of a household may be. And you can see here that sort of the household's ability to cover a $400 emergency expense in the treatment group, were significantly better than the control group. Now, in a lot of ways, that's intuitive, right? Poverty by definition is lack of cash, guys, right? So if we give them more income, their financial well-being is going to go up. But it really begs the question about how families leverage it. Next slide. Thank you, thank you. So looking just specifically at quality of life, you see that the people who are receiving the cash reported significantly lower levels of stress at the 6-month mark, so halfway through disbursements, and again at 12 months, but slightly higher levels at 18 months once the cash or the intervention had been removed. And then you can also see sort of looking at the Kessler scale down there at the bottom, that both treatment and controls sort of tended to hover right within the mild mental health disorder range of anxiety or depression throughout the treatment. This was not surprising to us. Receiving unconditional cash for only 12 months in the most expensive city, in the country, in the middle of the pandemic, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see huge changes here. But the other thing I just wanted to highlight is it's pretty natural to assume that increase in stress once the treatment is withdrawn is caused by the loss of the cash. But what we realized in sort of following up with people in qualitative interviewing is that was a little bit of a different, more complex and nuanced story than that. Participants really articulated that it had far more to do with the fact of a motivating stressor of saying, I know that this money is ending and I'm not anxious about it. So they certainly were, but it was more sort of along the lines of saying, okay, how can I best position myself and sort of accelerate the end of this experiment so that my family's in a better position than they were when we started. And you'll see that at the end. Next slide. Okay, so you look at food security, we see that in the treatment group, participants were significantly less likely to report eating less food due to resource scarcity than control at 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. Again, some of this is quantitative, some of it is qualitative. We also saw a really large shift in food quality and food choice. So families being really sort of direct in saying that they were skipping meals before they were in the treatment condition, and that they were also doing things like cutting down on fruits and vegetables because they were too expensive to purchase. Next slide. Now, interestingly enough, we did not see big changes on our health and well-being measures that were sort of rooted in some of the scales that I showed you prior. And at first, this seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, why would you not see change? You saw change in your other experiments on health. Well, first and foremost, that has to do with the duration of the pilot, right? We're only talking about 12 months of payments here. But second is sort of this concept from Arlene Geronimus and thinking about weathering, right? So if you know the literature on weathering, if you know the data on weathering, that you know that the racism, the marginalization that people experience in the economy shows up under the skin. It shows up as poor public health indicators. People sort of experience diseases early in the lifespan than they should. And it really wears the body down in such a way that we can actually measure it. Now, interestingly enough, the clinical onset of detectability for the sort of the processes that we know are associated with weathering, excuse me, tend to not appear until between the ages of 35 and 37, which is right about where the age of our sample is here. So we wouldn't expect to see big shifts. But what we did see was that introducing the guaranteed income sort of introduced this drive towards healthy behaviors that frankly we did not expect to see in such a short duration of a pilot. So by month 6, sort of after families were sort of over that period of scarcity, over that period of panic, and kind of things have calmed down for them, they sort of then had this drive. One of their primary goals was to see their bodies as an insurance policy and say, how can I take care of myself so that I can take care of my family and for my own well-being? And so we saw things like changes in food choices, increases in exercise, weight loss, improved sleep, really prioritizing therapy, in particular trauma therapy for themselves and their kids. And then the things that you would expect to see, like compliance with treatment plans and prescription medication that they had in many cases stopped fulfilling or sort of stopped following due to lack of resources. Next slide. So change in decision making. One of the things that we're really interested in this work is asking this question of what types of change do you see with what amount of cash over time, like over what period of time? And we've started to see across these experiments a really distinct pattern start to emerge as to how families approach the cash that's really different than a lump sum payment. So we know, first of all, I should have said this at the beginning, that a lump sum payment, let's say, an earned income tax credit payment where you're getting it one big chunk, right? Or the Alaska Dividend Fund. Those sort of types of cash interventions are fantastic for relieving material hardship, but there's no research that I know of or that my team knows of where those types of cash transfers are associated with any bigger changes in health and well-being, including financial well-being. It's reason being, if you think about it, if you've experienced economic marginalization throughout your lifespan, and maybe that's lasted more than one generation, that does something to the body, it does something to the mind, it does something to the spirit. And it would be almost pejorative for us to assume that, like, hey, I can just drop $10,000 on you in one fell swoop and you're just going to magically change your life, right? It's like, no, it takes a little bit more time than that. And so some of the logic behind guaranteed income is recurring payments, is that we know that when people are experiencing income volatility, that unpredictability creates a lot of stress in the family. And it also sort of eliminates the ability for people to imagine alternative pathways out of the situations that they're in. So what we saw in LA, and this has been reflected in other places, is that in months 1 through 6, again, we don't see change really on these domains until you're hitting that 6-month mark. So throughout months 1 through 6, families were really focused on establishing immediate safety. This involved things like meeting basic needs, securing housing in many cases, avoiding violence, and avoiding homelessness. In many cases, people were pretty savvy. Not a surprise if anybody here has experienced poverty or works with those who do, is that people leveraged the money to sort of buy time to get through waiting lists and other local programs that they had been in before. So in that first first 6 months, we saw exactly what we've seen across many of our sites, this calming of anxiety, this calming of scarcity, sort of this, almost Maslow's hierarchy of needs of saying, how do I establish immediate safety? Next slide. Now, part of establishing immediate safety in this particular site meant addressing IPV. So one of the things that was really exciting, and credit to Mara Garcetti for this, we've long wanted somebody to ask these questions about the ways in which unconditional cash might disrupt gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. The city of Los Angeles was the first and the only that was willing to ask this question publicly. So kudos to them. Story for another day as to how difficult that was and the level of pushback that we received. But I think that the findings speak for themselves here. We saw that overall, GI recipients reported lower levels of total IPV scores than control during the study period. And this was statistically significant at the 18-month follow-up. Key here, so just to think about this for a minute, we're talking about $12,000. It took $12,000 per family to lower severity and frequency of IPV with unconditional cash in LA. That is extraordinary. And I think we ought to be pretty excited about the power of that. Now, the key here is that distributing that guaranteed income to an identified person instead of to the household, which is, of course, opposite of things like the EITC, was key for providing a pathway for women to leave dangerous relationships. The fact that she owned the money herself and she could keep it secret however she chose to, that was the linchpin that allowed many women to get out of dangerous situations. Next slide. So when we think about change in decision-making, after we move through months 1 through 6, people, as they sort of hit months 6 through 9, entered into a really active goal-setting phase. At this point, they sort of started to establish proximate safety and saying, okay, now that I've kind of calmed scarcity, I've got a roof over my head, my back utilities are paid, my medical bills are paid, what do I do next? How do I move from here? And we really saw then a shift from immediate safety to proximate safety. And that included things like investing in children's well-being and mental health, engaging in reciprocity and mutual aid, and then really deep community engagement. Next slide. One of the principal ways we saw this reflected was enrichment. And so we saw that at the sort of 6-month mark, we started to see changes here, and that the GI recipients reported that their kids were enrolled in enrichment activities such as sports, clubs, lessons, music, things like that, childcare, in a way that we did not see in the control group. Now, on the one hand, it just sort of seems like a moot point, right? Like, okay, so now these kids are going to after school classes a little bit more. How exciting is that? It's deeper than that. So if we think about kind of the meaning that enrichment after school activities, sports, lessons, and clubs hold within sort of this notion of the American dream, whether you believe in it or not, or whether it's achievable or not, is really key. Those are things that not only provide childcare for families, but they're also ways in which we socialize children with a future orientation towards college, which is pretty important. Next slide. We think again about establishing proximate safety. We're also interested in looking at community engagement and environment. So you see that GI recipients here reported significantly more positive engagement with their neighbors at 6 months, 12 months, and then 18 months throughout the study. 18 months, again, that's 6 months after the cash has been withdrawn, and you're still seeing that shift. Now, most exciting for me as a social worker is that we also saw that the people in the treatment condition were much less likely to fear violence in the community when they're a member of the treatment group. And at first, it sort of seems like, why? Like, why would that happen? Why would you see that finding? But again, this is the beauty of mixed methods research. What we realized in sort of following up with families in our sort of in-depth interview was that it came down to time. When you are running all over a city trying to recertify benefits, working 60, 70 hours a week, trying to keep a roof over your head, you don't have time to get to know your neighbors. So those proverbial ideas that Carol Stack talked about back in the 1970s about all our kin, what late stage capitalism has done is robbed us of that. The very safety nets that we build in community, the sort of the alternative ways of being, mutual aid, those pieces also play into our fears of community violence. And we're hitting this tipping point. There's lots I could say about this, but I'll hold off for now unless somebody has a question about it later. We're hitting this tipping point with inequality in the United States that we are not just robbing people of economic stability, we're robbing them from relationships. Because if everyone in your community can barely make ends meet, they also don't know one another. So they literally do not have time for relationships. Next slide. So change in decision-making, future safety. So what do people do at the end of the pilot? When folks started to hit months 9, 10, 11, 12, they started to anticipate future material hardship, and their desire was to establish future safety for their families. So interestingly enough, if you're familiar with the literature on cash, the behavior at the back end of the pilot was really similar to what we see in the Alaska Dividend Fund research or in lump sum payment research, is that people started to stock up on household goods. So doing things like this quote here you see on the slide, and also doing things like buying children's clothing and the next sizes up that they know their kids are going to hit the next year. But most importantly, I think for our purposes in terms of thinking about social policy is employment. So we're talking in many cases here about young families, and what they did sort of in those last 3 months of the experiment was to kind of leverage the cash in such a way to find an employment opportunity that was more conducive to parenting. So finding a job that was closer to home, that reduced commute time, or finding things that would actually be more predictable. So for those who are familiar with Susan Lambert's work on this and Julia Henley's, sort of putting it directly into conversation with that, with kind of, they knew that unpredictability of work was showing up in such a way in their household that they were literally prevented from being able to follow, the parenting that practices that they wanted to. So as simple as putting kids to bed at the same time every night. Next slide. So to summarize from LA, these are kind of our key findings here. Financial well-being treatment group had a significantly increased ability to cover a $400 emergency. With health, we saw that the treatment group saw a significant decrease in food insecurity and increase in health promotion. We went over IPV quite a bit. Decision-making, we saw that people moved from establishing immediate safety to proximate safety and then future safety. Parenting, we saw that the treatment group, parents were significantly more likely than control to maintain enrichment and extracurricular activities for kids. Then community, of course, we see that the treatment group members are significantly more likely to report reduced fear of community violence and more positive interactions with neighbors. Next slide. So to just shift gears a bit and kind of zoom back out, I just talked about LA at length, but I just kind of wanted to give you an overview as to where we're at right now with our findings, and you can see these data on our CGIAR website if you're interested. So we know that in the domain of financial stability, we've seen that as positive in 7 out of 7 sites. And this shows up as improved financial capability and improved ability to handle a $400 emergency. Employment is a bit mixed. We see consistent upticks in full-time employment. We do see reductions in unemployment. And we see shifts from full-time employment or sort of multiple part-time jobs to sort of one part-time job amongst moms of young kids in 3 out of 7 sites. I think that's really key because, as you know, without paid leave and paid family leave, many of our new moms are forced to choose between terrible market work and parenting, which is kind of, I'll just say it, it's sick that our system forces people to do this. You can see sort of the rest of these here as well. For the sake of time, I just want to move to our very last slide about sort of future directions. Yeah, that's perfect. So I mentioned briefly, and hopefully some of this will come up in the Q&A as well, that we're in this kind of third wave of experimentation with cash. So when we started this work in 2018, there were just 4 sort of sites across the United States that were doing this work. So it was Stockton, California. We had Baby's First Years. We had Magnolia Mothers Trust, and then Open Research. Fast forward to now, there's over 155 or something to that effect, pilots across the United States, some of which are empirically driven, some of which are not. And this explosion has come with some risks and some opportunities. First, we have this explosion of fintech to where there are new risks being introduced into the space and into the safety net that really have to do with venture capital. So it behooves a question of us all who are doing the work on unconditional cash to ask questions like saying, why is it that a private for-profit company backed by venture capital is suddenly interested in distributing unconditional cash? What are the risks there? What are the surveillance mechanisms that we might then be unintentionally embedding into community? There's some key questions there that we need to ask. Second, one of the things that we learned, specific to LA, but also in some of our other sites as well, was that trust and uptake in this experiment was really bolstered by using well-known services. So the Angelinos card was a prepaid debit card that many people in the city had from the pandemic. It's something that Los Angeles was already using through Mocify, a Black wealth building organization. So that meant that, for instance, women who are experiencing intimate partner violence didn't have to explain the existence of a new fintech app on their phone, for instance, or a new debit card. The money was layered into a debit card that she already had, and that really created not only an implementation mechanism that we could build on in the future, but it also created a pathway out. And then just thinking, the last thing I'll kind of just want to say here is thinking about leveraging prevention opportunities. This is the part that I don't believe Willie is able to join us today. So I'm just going to say something quickly about this. We know a lot about unconditional cash in terms of short-term experiments, but how unconditional cash can work alongside other interventions like asset building is still really unknown. We're at the very, very beginning of this process. And so one of the ways that, one of the things we're excited about, I should say, moving forward into the future is thinking about what would happen if we took a guaranteed income intervention, which is aimed at addressing income inequality, not wealth inequality, and then instead paired it with something like an asset building mechanism, which is addressing the wealth gap. Then you're talking about income and wealth at the same time. Or what would happen if we carefully sort of positioned an unconditional cash intervention like guaranteed income just as a family was leaving transitional housing, for instance. So we're sort of moving into this space where we can think really creatively. And again, thinking about this framework of reducing extreme inequalities is a sort of a phenomenon that cuts across all of our silos, all of our social problems. And so we're beginning to think more creatively about what would happen if we sort of sharply tailored unconditional cash to be infused and layered within these city services such that we can have a new turn in the safety net. That's all that I'll share for now, because I believe that Trina is going to guide us in some questions. And thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. That was good. Thank you so much, Jen. That was very good as well. I'm going to put the quizzes before I forget so that we can make sure everyone who wants CEUs can get them. So let's go back and UBI poll. Here we go. First question. Uh-oh. It's not coming. Ah, great. Okay, well, let's try second question. Nothing's launching anymore. Okay. I'm not sure why. Well, there's a raised hand. So we have a question, I think from Stephen. Let's see if I can, while I'm figuring out the polls, let's see if I can give you an opportunity to speak. So hold on just a second. Stephen. Okay. Let's see. Oh goodness, who raised their hand? I'm sorry.
If folks want to drop questions in the Q&A box, we can jump in.
That's probably just as good. That's probably better.
Yeah, no problem.
Any questions in the Q&A box? And I also am trying to still get the polls to work because we need to get at least one more. And they're not working either, so this is just great fun. Okay. Do you see anything in the questions? Well, I do. I have something for both of you, Jen and Amy.
Go for it.
Given that we were talking a lot about kind of the 21st century economic security, and we've talked individually about a great experiment around child development accounts in CEDOK, and we talked about all of these wonderful programs that are being done throughout the country in guaranteed income. But if you could kind of wave your magic wand and figure out how to combine some of these research findings to think about what would be good on the ground for families facing economic insecurity, how to kind of within our existing social safety net, how to kind of bring these things together in ways that help family over a longer time period. Amy, why don't you go first, and then Jen, you could jump in.
Sure. Trina, the magic wand question. Come on. I'm going to answer this two ways. The first I'll say is gosh, the data are still so new. I think I'm often hesitant to answer this question because sitting where I do, one of my greatest fears with this work is that we've almost been too successful with narrative. So what I mean by that is that the public conversation, the sort of political momentum is moving in many cases much faster than the data. And when I look back throughout US history, I can connect almost any social problem that a student wants to write a paper about back to the New Deal. And so we know that today's policy gaps are tomorrow's dissertations. And if we're not cautious in the way that we unroll unconditional cash, we're going to create new social problems, particularly if we don't do the careful work of dismantling the myth of the welfare queen and sort of these pejorative narratives around shame and blame and deservedness. We're just going to move them off of TANF onto asset building and guaranteed income if we don't sort of interrogate those assumptions. That being said, the closest thing I would like to see at this point, I'm hesitant to sort of say from a policy perspective, would be thinking about things like trigger policies or negative income tax experiments, right? To where when unemployment, for instance, is hitting a certain threshold, would it then kick in? Or sort of thinking about ways in which the places where we know unconditional cash works well is like IPV, for instance, rather than forcing people to go through these ridiculous financial literacy programs, which we know from plenty of research are responsible for 0.01% of financial behaviors. That's the one thing I'll say I wish we would act like immediately is financial literacy programs, because mountains and mountains of research shows it doesn't work, but for some reason we keep believing that we can budget our way out of poverty or somehow teach low-income people how to outsmart Wall Street. Like, that's unbelievably ludicrous, but for some reason we just keep doing it. So that would be like, if I could wave one wand, it would be to try and get CBOs and nonprofits to get themselves out of this position of spending millions and millions of dollars on financial literacy programs that don't have any evidence that show that they actually increase people's financial well-being. That's very different than financial capability, of course, but that's as close as I would get. Jin probably has a better answer because his topic area has been doing this work for much longer than I have.
Particularly, Jen, if you could talk about some of the countries like Canada and Israel and other places that have already tried to combine them in some ways. Some things are actually happening.
So I think I completely agree with Amy, and Amy actually talked about the important vision that we should do policy work, institutional building for the future safety net, other than thinking about changing people's behavior through financial education and financial literacy. So I think the large vision here, actually we see the similar mechanisms in both studies, right? Amy was talking about how providing cash really changed people's food insecurity, stress, and then their behaviors, like thinking about the future development and empowerment of the enrichment of children. And similarly, we see quite similar mechanism how assets affect child development and children's development. So in our Seed OK study, we have this policy intervention change people's maternal depression, and then change parent-child education and parenting behaviors, and then children's long-term development. So we see quite similar mechanisms from cash as income and cash as assets. So it's very important to build on, I think, Amy's idea that we really need to have this inclusive, streamlined policy vehicle, the institutional building, policy building to provide cash, provide income, and provide asset building opportunities for all individuals. So I think that's a very important vision for the future safety net. And we are able to do that, to have this inclusive policy vehicle in the future. Yeah.
Awesome. So, I figured, oh, go ahead.
No, just going back to your question, like for example, in Israel, their CDAs are combining with child allowance together, right? So through the same vehicle, through the same policy vehicle, parents receiving the child allowance for consumption, for children's education, And then they can also transfer part of this allowance, income support, into asset building. So that could be one example respond to your question, Trina.
Awesome. I figured out how to make the polls work, so I'm going to put those. And then Stephen has a question. I think I unmuted you, so you should be able to ask your question, Stephen.
Yes, I can't. I can't seem to take my put my camera on. But in any event, and I put this into the question box as well. But I work with an organization called the National Jobs for All Network, and we advocate for a basic human right to employment using public job creation along the lines of what was done in the New Deal with the Civil Works Administration, among other programs. And what I'm interested in is if the presenters have any comments about how this might interact. That is to say, a federal job guarantee might interact with the programs that they're talking about. Sometimes these income support programs are presented as being in competition with federal job guarantees. I think I see them as being complementary, and I'm curious what presenters might have to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right, and especially on the sort of this notion of thinking of them as being in competition, right? And I mean, what more evidence do we need that we've internalized neoliberalism, that when we're thinking about interventions for poverty, we're like, we only get one, right? Like, that's crazy, right? Like, that makes no sense. So yeah, as far as like the ways that I see it interacting, it is a both and, of course. But also think about the way that money works, right? So if you're receiving money from a job, and we see this a lot in our guaranteed income experiments, let's say that you're working, multiple part-time jobs, and you've just had the opportunity of your dreams, right? A neighbor or somebody that you know is offering you full-time employment, and you finally get that chance to move from gig work or part-time work into sort of a career position that's a full-time job with benefits. Think about the way that the pay works for that, right? You start a new job, you got to go through training, HR, and then also think about how the money's dispersed. You typically don't get that first paycheck, in many cases for 30 days, in some cases for 60 days. So if you're somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck, right, you not only have to then skip work to apply for a job that you have no guarantee of getting, right? Then you add in the mix, even if you do get the job, you have to take the time to sort of step out of one job, start another one, and then wait out getting that first paycheck. In many cases, that's what a lot of academics experience, right? Or we think about our doctoral students, they graduate in May, they get their last stipend, check from the university. Let's say that they won the academic lottery and they get that prize tenure track job. Well, guess what? They still have no paycheck till the last week of September. They're functionally living without income for 6 months. That's how the market functions for low income people. So when I think about something like the federal jobs guarantee, what would be really, interesting is, like I was saying before, thinking about ways to wedge something like an unconditional cash intervention, like guaranteed income or something else, to help people sort of buy time for those other services to pick up. Because even if we did have a jobs guarantee, if you're that close to the poverty line, you just can't wait to do federal paperwork to figure out whether or not such and such is going to work for you. And so I think of it as sort of, a layered approach to where they can work with one another. I also think that efforts like a jobs guarantee deal with some of the ethical issues around UBI, because the reality is, if we're talking about universal basic income, if you're receiving it in perpetuity, then we're supplementing corporations not paying a living wage. And that's fairly problematic for multiple reasons. Jen, I don't know what you wanted to add to that. And then I see our data scientist Nidhi on as well.
Yes, very quickly. Thanks, Stephen. I think that's a great question. I think guaranteed employment definitely is complement with universal asset building, right? In the United States, the largest asset building program now is the retirement savings program, which is based on employment. And another thing you can see from the universal asset building or child development accounts or child savings account is that we are allowing multiple sources for the asset building, for the deposits and employers, and employment-based deposit could be another source. Thank you.
Awesome. And I think we have one more question and then we're going to close out. We're right at time, but I want Nindi Tandon to have a chance to ask a question. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My question was around the Oklahoma study. I guess it's more to do with the rules around the 529 plans that is used in the research design. Now, some of these rules can be pretty complicated for a lot of these parents to, work around, especially the rules around withdrawals or penalties, and what happens in case the youth suddenly decides that college is not for them. Were the parents made aware of it? I mean, I know we don't have data yet, but I was just wondering if um, you know some information was provided to the parents around that aspect.
Thank you. That's a great question. Now, for the seed OK policy experiment, so we have to work with what we have, and we use the existing 529 college savings plan as the existing vehicle, and then repurpose that for child development accounts. But ideally, if we want to have lifelong asset building policy program, then the assets accumulated in this vehicle eventually could be transferred into, for example, retirement savings accounts or other asset building policy vehicle. So let's use Singapore as an example. They also have child development accounts based on the purpose of child development accounts for post-secondary education. But after a certain period of time, reach certain age, then individuals or families can transfer their assets for other purposes like housing provident fund or retirement provident fund. So ideally, we really want to have lifelong asset building for different purposes. But in Seed OK policy experiment, we have this kind of existing policy constraint, and we have to use this policy vehicle we have at this point we have in the United States, and we have automatic account opening and an automatic investment through stay-on accounts. So for that part, actually, parents do not need to learn the specific rule of 529 college savings plan. However, for their own accounts, they have to go through the application process and figure out how to choose the investment options among the available options they have in the OK529 plans.
All right, so on that note, I will close this down. I will just say that I'm going to channel my Willie Elliott for a second. And there are a few cities in the United States that actually are doing what are kind of child development accounts, guaranteed income, sometimes even larger amounts of a child account, which are sometimes called baby bonds. One for sure is St. Paul, Minnesota, and the wonderful mayor they have there, Mayor Carter. And so hopefully these won't just be, hopes and dreams for the future, but something that actually is reality. And I'd like to end by thanking all of the co-leads for the grand challenge to reduce extreme economic inequality. This is our last event of this year, but we will also be having a SIG at SSWR if you want to learn more. And with that, I will close us out. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Jen. Thank you for all our participants. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.